Welcome to episode 105 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. Today, we get to speak to Joe Lewis, who served in the FBI for 27 years. In this episode, Joe Lewis reviews SandBomb, the investigation into the bombing of a Birmingham, Alabama abortion clinic that resulted in the death of an off-duty police officer, Robert Sanderson, and severely injured a nurse. The case also identified Eric Rudolph as the person responsible for the Olympic Park bombing, as well as the bombing of another abortion clinic and a nightclub in Atlanta, Georgia. More than 5 years after the incident, Eric Rudolph was captured and pled guilty to the Birmingham abortion clinic bombing and also accepted responsibility for the bombings in Atlanta. Joe Lewis led this investigation as the special agent in charge of the Birmingham Division. Prior to this assignment in Birmingham, Joe Lewis served in several other management positions, including as the supervisor of the Chicago Division's Public Corruption Squad. Joe Lewis retired from the FBI as the Deputy Assistant Director, Organized Crime Branch Criminal Investigative Division, in charge of all organized crime investigations and intelligence. In the private sector, Joe Lewis served as Senior Director of Corporate Investigations for Walmart's Global Security Division. He is now also retired from corporate life. This is a transparent review of this case. Joe talks candidly about some interagency issues that came up during the investigation of this matter. But before we get to the interview, I just have a few quick things to talk to you about. First of all, I want to remind you about our DC podcast meetup in Washington, D.C. on March 18th, 2018 at Busboys and Poets, which is at 1025 5th Street, Northwest Washington, also known as 5th and K. I'll be there with Esther from Once Upon a Crime podcast, Deanna from Twisted Philly podcast, and Haley from Murder Road Trip podcast. And I will be bringing with me some really cool You Can't Get This at Target FBI swag for door prizes. So I hope you drop by Busboys and Poets from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. on March 18th. And do me a favor, if you're coming, go to Facebook events and put in DC Podcast Meetup and check off that you're going. The other two things I want to remind you of is that I am a crime fiction author, and I'd love for you to check out my book, Pay to Play, available as a ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook on Amazon.com. I would also like to invite you to be a member of my reader team. Just once a month, I send out a digest email where I collate the previous month's podcast episodes and my crime fiction recommendations. I also keep you up to date on what's happening with me and cliches and misconceptions about the FBI. For the month of March, I will be reviewing the feature film Solace, starring Anthony Hopkins. It's a movie about a number of unsolved homicides where the FBI enlists the assistance of a retired consultant with psychic powers. So if you want to know what I thought about the movie, what they got right, what they got wrong, sign up for my reader team and get the March email. You can go to jerrywilliams.com and sign up when you see the pop-up, or go to my Facebook page, Jerry Williams Author, and you'll see the sign up button there. So thank you so much. Now here's the show. I am absolutely excited to introduce my guest for today, Joe Lewis. Hi, Joe. How are you?
Just fine. And yourself, Jerry?
I'm doing good. when you retired from the FBI in 2004. You retired as the Deputy Assistant Director for Organized Crime. It's an honor that you agreed to come on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's a great opportunity.
There's so much about the FBI that's in the news, but it's not about the real FBI. And another thing that I really want to do is to encourage diversity in the FBI. I send this out to everyone who ever dreamed about being an agent and to those who never, ever thought about it.
It is a significant opportunity, and one that, as you say, is missed out on by a lot of people who don't come in contact with or have any knowledge about the agency. So I think it's a very good idea.
Well, thank you. So today we're going to talk about a case that was codenamed SandBomb. And many people will probably be aware of the general investigation, but you're going to take us to one of the cases that made up this investigation. So why don't you take us from the very start when this bombing of an abortion clinic occurred?
Yeah, there were a lot of abortion rights issues that was promulgated around that time, and in fact, a couple of doctors that were murdered who were doing those services for women. The bombings didn't actually start until in 1996. In fact, the first that we eventually made a connection with happened at the Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta, Georgia. At that point, again, it was against the Olympics. They did not know who was the target or anything else. About a year later, there was another bombing in Atlanta, and that one was targeted at an abortion clinic. Here again, they didn't know at the time whether they were connected or not, but eventually we were able to determine that. Ours happened January 29th of 1998. This was the fourth bombing in the Southeast. I was sitting in my office usually I'm an early bird, so I'm usually in the office by 6, have coffee, reading communications from headquarters. And about 7:30, I heard a loud noise that rattled the windows in the office, the FBI office in downtown Birmingham. And I was able to look out and see a puff of black smoke that erupted from that bombing. And at the time, we didn't know what it may have been about, but within minutes, we left the office heading towards what was a part of the campus of UAB. And that's where we determined that the bombing had indeed took place, and it was against the New Woman, all-women healthcare clinic there in Birmingham. Unfortunately, a police officer, off-duty Birmingham PD officer, who was there that morning checking out the facility, saw this device. Actually, it was a flower pot that was leaned over as if it had spilled. And he was carefully checking it when it went off, when it was detonated. The bomb obviously exploded, killed him. He flew about 15 feet back into the wrought iron fence that was surrounding the clinic. And about the same time, a nurse that worked at the clinic had arrived that morning to open the clinic. And she saw him doing what he was doing and turned to go into the building to open up. Unfortunately, she got struck by shrapnel that was in the bomb. She lost one eye, was severely injured, but she eventually recovered. That bombing threw everything that day into a different motion that I had never seen and never been involved in.
At the time of this bombing, were you the special agent in charge of the Birmingham office?
Yes. I met with the agencies that were involved. Of course, the Birmingham police chief, Mike Coppage, came to the scene. The ATF-SAC, Jim Kavanaugh, was there on the scene. And the U.S. attorney at the time, Jones, was there. And we calmly talked about strategy and what we needed to do. And, of course, the crime scene was cordoned off, and the reason it was cordoned off was because of the nature of the bombings in Atlanta that took place the previous year, starting with the Olympic Park bombing. The bomber got sophisticated in that he would set off a bomb, and knowing that responders would show up, would set up another bomb. We arrived on the scene. We cordoned off the area, of course, and we had entire police departments showing up, trying to help out. A coordinated effort that, to me, I've never seen before. I mean, and there was no one really stepping on anyone's toes. Issues that came up later on I'll talk about, but we already knew from the outset. We made plans from the outset of who was going to handle what. The FBI handled the case in general, the case in chief. We gave ATF the issue of handling the device and the evidence. And each police department, and there were a ton of police departments that showed up to this bombing, not only Birmingham, but there are a lot of local police departments that were around and responded to the bomb. There were a number of things going on at the same time. Now, Jerry, what I'm about to tell you is something that we don't, as a law enforcement officer, we don't tend to subscribe to. But a young man who was a student at UAB, heard the bomb, saw the smoke coming from it. He thought it was in his line of sight, there was a pizza place in line of sight from where the bomb took place. So he didn't know it was at the clinic. But he was in a laundry room doing laundry, and he turned when the bomb flew and saw a lot of people that were running, mainly students, running towards where the bombing took place. And he identified one individual that was going in the opposite direction. He decides to take on a surveillance mode to follow this guy because it was his feeling that this guy must have been involved in the bombing.
Wow.
He gave us our most significant lead, and then there were others, because of his actions, there were others involved. He followed the guy, lost him at one point, picked him up again, stopped at a McDonald's, enlisted a guy that was sitting there in the McDonald's and told him, hey, look, could you help me? Could you please keep an eye on this guy trying to call the police? He called 911, waited for the police to arrive. When police arrived, he gave them the description of who he was looking at and who he was following, and then proceeded to go follow him again. He and the other guy took him to his truck. We were able to, based on that information, subsequently identify Eric Rudolph as the bomber.
Wow.
Yeah, and the only thing that stopped us from getting him before he left the state, this was one thing that was identified when you start talking about after-action reports. Because of the number of the police departments in that area, and in the state for that matter, none of them were on the same channels, and none of them could communicate to each other. So when we had identified the vehicle and got the plate and then identified who the person was, we couldn't broadcast it where all police departments could get it. So we consequently had to follow him, and did for a while, follow him on the highway. There were people that he was getting in issues with, whether he was passing them or they were driving too slow for him, this being Rudolph. And he'd hold up his middle finger, and we interviewed people that saw him on the highway and which way he was headed. That by the time we identified who he was, we were at his residence the next day, the evening of the 30th. We were at his residence. He was living in a trailer. We were on him so close that he left that mobile home about an hour or two before we got there. The door was open, lights was on. We had just missed him when he left there.
Why wasn't he pulled over when he was being followed on the highway?
Because there was no way to communicate who we were looking for to all of the police departments. The anecdotal information we were getting were from people that we were stopping as we were going along, because he got on 85, I believe it was 85, and was heading back to North Carolina. There was no way to communicate the All Points Bulletin. When we finally got it out, there was just no way for anyone for us to communicate that through all the 3 states.
All right, so there was nobody, you knew he was on the highway, but there was nobody right behind him with an eyeball on his car.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
There were incidents going along. For example, a woman who he got behind was holding him up on the highway, and when he got a chance to pass her, he kind of screamed at her and yelled all kind of profanities, which she didn't hear, and then held up his finger at her. Now, we happened to run into that woman, and she told us that is what happened with the truck. Once we told her what we were looking for, the truck we were looking for, she said, yes, he passed me not too long ago, and, and that's how things transpired through the whole process. So we had a number of witnesses who were there from the time the bomb went off until, again, he got on the road and was running, that we identified through process of just sheer hard work, trying to shut down the whole place and figure out where this guy might be going, or the person who we didn't know.
So this young man who identified him and followed him, he was believed from the very beginning.
Absolutely. And we protected him all the way through the process, praised him a heck of a lot. And in fact, there was thoughts of, and I don't know whatever happened, but there were thoughts of us, because at one point we had, I think it was $1 million reward up for information leading to the arrest of Eric. We all thought that the guy was deserving, and I think we ended up identifying 2 or 3 people who were deserving of some award of some type. But obviously we hadn't had the case closed yet, and we didn't want to taint anything. But it was discussions that was had relative to how we could repay them for the services that he had. Now, I will tell you this. Again, we're sitting there on the street, command post and all, probably for about 3 or 4 days. Going through the process of the crime scene search, interviews. We had no cars. We let no cars leave the area until they were identified, and the individuals the owners were identified and interviewed, and what have you.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how you handled the crime scene? You're talking to us about cars coming in and out. How were you able to keep people in and out, and what did you do to check to see if there was a second bomb in the area?
Yeah, that's the process we went through. We shut everything down. I mean, as I told you before, I mean, we had more resources there than you could shake a stick at. Again, all types of law enforcement. The campus police was there. They brought resources with them. We shut down the street. We did not allow any vehicles to leave. We, in fact, made everyone stay where they were or to return to their dorms or their homes. And we did, the bomb squads did a search of the immediate area. It's like a 2-block area, trying to see if there were any other packages that was located or secreted someplace that could be of issue. That was the first thing that happened. It took probably a couple, 3 hours to get that situated. And in doing that, every car was identified. Every owner was identified for each of the vehicles. They were interviewed before the vehicles were permitted to leave. It was done by the sheer number of resources that we had there that responded to the scene.
Now, I would take it that the doctor who ran the abortion clinic was the real target.
In this case, it may or may not have been, but the issue that really caused the commotion to happen was because the police officer was, or the off-duty officer was prodding this device. Eric was sitting about 100 yards, standing about 100 yards away from the device. I mean, he detonated remotely. That's how it went off. What Eric was trying to do was do as much damage as he could to the clinic itself And if there were people there, and of course he saw the police officer there, he knew what he was doing when he detonated that, because it immediately killed the police officer. And I said the nurse who had arrived to open up, she was hit with the shrapnel that was in their nails and what have you that he had placed in the bomb. I think it was just at the clinic itself. It wasn't an issue with a doctor, because I don't even know who the doctor, to this day, who the doctor was that was running that clinic. I know it was ran by women, but the doctor who was supposed to be working there, I didn't even know who he or she was.
And the only reason I mention that is I understand that this was probably the first bombing of an abortion clinic, but prior to this, doctors and people working at abortion clinics around the country had been shot or shot at.
Correct. That is correct. But again, here, the similar thing that happened at Atlanta, the bombing there of the abortion clinic in Atlanta, he wasn't looking specifically to harm any physician. As a matter of fact, he was just trying to do property damage. The one in Atlanta is when he used the second device. And the second device did injure some FBI folks and some law enforcement folks. But fortunately, there were two vehicles in between where the bomb was actually secreted, and the agents were on the other side of those vehicles. But there were some injuries of agents as a result of the secondary explosion. So he was not only trying to harm doctors. I think he was just trying to harm facilities, and in so doing, get first responders, because that was, again, his second bomb in Atlanta. He had a third that he tried to do the same thing. It was placed at a bar that was frequented by lesbians, and he put a bomb against the windowsill of this particular bar. It exploded. It injured some people that was inside, but when the first responders arrived, there was another bomb that they found that was aimed at the responders that arrived. Fortunately, they located it, and they rendered it safe. They had to blow it up, so no one outside got injured with that. He was just trying to do damage, and to the extent if he could get somebody hurt, the responders, that's what he was all about.
So what was his cause? I mean, obviously he's a domestic terrorist, and he has some ideology or some fight, but I don't understand what it is. If he's after first responders and abortion clinics and lesbian bars, what is his, whatever it is, his warped thinking? What is he fighting against or fighting for?
Yeah, that was never totally clear because, again, he was anti-government, he was anti-Jew, he was anti-abortions clinics, and with this bar bombing, again, he threw us for a loop there. Again, there was a place where lesbians hung out. So what was his actual motive? I have no clue, because he was all over the place. His family was tied up in the anti-government movement. They moved to Iowa at one point. They stayed with some anti-government people out there. They came back to these, but there was some discussion about, whether what was his true motive in doing these things. And I think it was just an issue of hate. He just wanted to harm as many people as he can based on what his true feeling was, which was he didn't like the government, and he thought that this was the best way to get at it.
So when you are able to identify him through the license plate on his truck and you go to his trailer, what do you know about Eric Rudolph at that time? Is that a name that was known to law enforcement?
Not at all. Not at all. As a matter of fact, we didn't know who he was and what he was until we identified the car and the fact that now we knew it was his car. Now, whether it was him or not, it was something we didn't know at the time as well. But based on the descriptions that we got and what photos we had, we were able to tie it down. And one of the things he confessed to us once it was over was the fact that he did not intend to admit to doing anything. And his problem is that because of the fact that he was identified in Birmingham for that bombing, is the only reason that he went ahead and decided to plead guilty to all of the charges so that he wouldn't have to get the death penalty. They took the death penalty off the table.
Well, I'm very interested in how the FBI and ATF, how they were able to identify all of these bombings as being done by the same person.
Okay, good point. Let me start with that, because one of the most difficult things that happened during this process, we were having a great kumbaya with all the law enforcement agencies there in Birmingham. Now, Atlanta had issues from the beginning. And as I told you, I was standing out in the street where the command post was, and I'm talking to the deputy director and giving him an update within an hour or so after the bombing of where we were and what was going on. So he asked me the question. He says, what can I get you? What resources you need? I told him I didn't need any resources. I told him, however, that I called the Atlanta office of the FBI and asked them if they would send somebody over who was experienced with the bombings there. And the reason I asked for that, I said, look, there's a chance that this might be connected. We're so close. We're 2 hours away. This might be connected to the Olympic and the other two bombings there in Georgia. And I said, I spoke to the SAC, and he told me he didn't have any resources to give. And, that was it. So the deputy director said, well, look, okay, I'll get that resolved. So they ended up sending over 2 local law enforcement guys from Georgia. And, Jerry, I tell you, they were having issues with their cases. Their case had been going for 2 years. They had 120 potential suspects. And if you might recall, the one that got the most notoriety was Richard Jewell.
Yes. Yeah, there are going to be people here who are listening to this who don't know who Richard Jewell is and his connection to the bombing during the Olympics in Atlanta. Could you refresh our memories real quick about that?
Sure. Richard Jewell was a security person working at the Olympics, and the person that identified the knapsack that eventually blew up. And he came forward and assisted and became a potential suspect. And as a matter of fact, he was derided as being the person responsible for the bomb for a long time. He eventually sued the Bureau or the federal government or whatever and won eventually. But it caused a great deal of consternation, and they still had a significant number of people that they had on the list. The reason I called them over was for that fact. They didn't have a clue as to who might have done any of the bombings there, but I figured that with ATF doing the evidence, ATF did the evidence in Atlanta, that if there is a connection, we'll find that connection within the evidence. And they certainly found it. And that led to a lot of issues between our offices because as soon as that was confirmed, Atlanta started running leads and everything off of the case in Birmingham.
So at the beginning, when you first asked for help from Atlanta, which is really sad to have to report, but when you first asked for help from the Atlanta Division, they said no. But once it was established that the bombings in the Birmingham Division and the Atlanta Division were connected, now all of a sudden they want to take over. They want to take over.
And in fact, at one point did, and I don't want to get into the ugly side of this, but as you can imagine, it caused a lot of concerns that went all the way up to the point that Janet Reno had to get involved in it. Louis had sent out communications, joining the cases and moving all the Birmingham case over to Atlanta to be run by the Atlanta office, or at least that's what he intended to do. I disagree with it. I told him it was a mistake. Atlanta had too many things going on, including trying to run our case as well, that to me was going to cause a lot of problems down the road to get the thing prosecuted. But he gave me my orders, and we packed the case up and sent the evidence that we had and what have you over to Atlanta. But Doug Jones, he was a U.S. attorney at the time. We had a meeting with him, Mike Coppage, Jim Kavanaugh, they said, look, we can't have this happen. I said, well, look, I'm out of it. I've been told that I've got to pack our case up and it's going to FBI in Atlanta. They said, Doug Jones said, look, we're going to take this to Reno. And they took it to Reno, and she decided to keep the cases separate. As it turned out, we had the stronger case. That's the one that got ultimately prosecuted first and caused Eric Rudolph to plead to the cases in Atlanta. So it all got resolved in the end. But what I really want to spend some time talking about is the notion of the issues that related to all of the individuals that were working there, including the witnesses that we had. There were thousands of interviews conducted. The work was shared across the board. All the agencies that were there that responded, everyone was professional. They knew that there was a task at hand. They attacked the task, and we were fortunate enough to have some eyewitnesses that went one step beyond what people you would think would do. And they followed the guy back to his truck, which gave us that lead to go. Atlanta had the responsibility of trying to get information on where he might be there in Andrews. And we spent...
Andrews. What is Andrews? I'm sorry.
North Carolina. Andrews is where Eric lived in North Carolina. It's in the area of where he used to live.
Oh, that's where the trailer was?
Yeah, it was in that general area, yeah. He grew up in those mountainous areas, and in fact, we had interviewed all of his people, associates, friends, girlfriends, and the girlfriend had mentioned to us that he always bragged about the fact that, if he ever got in trouble or anything, that he could hide in the mountains of North Carolina and never be caught. And he was about half right, because it took 5.5 years before we were able to catch him. And again, that was by accident when he eventually got caught.
And so during this 5.5 years that he evaded captivity, you believe, or law enforcement believes, he was hiding in the wooded area in North Carolina?
Yeah, and that's where we had a team of individuals assigned to, and they'd stay there on a 2-week basis, and they'd rotate out, and other people would be brought in. And that ran for all of that time until it got scaled down just before he got caught. But we knew he was in that area, and again, from my perspective, I thought that he was getting assistance from some locals of like mind, anti-government folks. And there was one gentleman who came forward and said, yeah, I did help him. I gave him a truck and some food and what have you. But it went on for 5.5 years, and again, he was caught dumpster diving for food outside of the back of this grocery store, and was seen by a rookie police officer who identified him and arrested him. Otherwise, we'd still be sitting there probably waiting to see when he'd come out.
What were the things that helped everyone connect Eric Rudolph with the Birmingham bombing and the Atlanta bombings? Was it parts of the bombing material that was located in all the scenes? Were they made with similar materials?
Yes, that was the main issue between the connections. And again, when I said earlier, that's why I wanted Atlanta to be involved, because the evidence that was handled for the Atlanta bombings was done by ATF. They had control, ran labs on most of the stuff there. Bureau Lab was included in some things, but for the most part, the ATF lab handled all of that. So we had the ATF in Birmingham handle all the evidence, but we felt that if there was a connection, we'd find it in the device, and that's exactly what happened. As a matter of fact, when he got arrested and just before he pled, he led us to a stash of, I think it was 250 pounds of dynamite, to include a bomb that he had made and had set across the street. He had buried it across the street from the armory where the agents were staged for these searches. And his intent was at one point to come back and detonate that to kill as many agents and people there as humanly possible. But fortunately, he got caught. And when he was interviewed, he finally told us what he had done and where he had all the tools. And when we searched his residence, the mobile home, there was remnants of dynamite that was picked up, and there was some other stuff that we had located that helped also with the Atlanta bombings as well. Atlanta had photos of a guy at the Olympics, but it wasn't a good quality photograph. They had attempts to enhance it to see if they could determine who it was, and it turned out it was Eric. They couldn't do it by any technical means, but he eventually told them that was him that they had seen in the photograph from the Olympics when he had set the bomb down.
So could you tell us all of the bombings and incidents that Eric Rudolph eventually was charged with that he accepted responsibility for?
On July 27th of 1996, the Centennial Park bombing had taken place. That was the first that initiated all of the bombings. And then on January 16th, almost a year later, 1997, a bomb exploded on the back walkway of the Sandy Springs Professional Building housing the Northside Family Clinic in suburban Atlanta. He was convicted of that one as well. And then on the 21st of February, about 5 weeks after the clinic bombing there in Atlanta, he detonated another bomb outside of the lounge that I was talking about. First, the bomb was set on the windowsill, injured 5 customers inside the lounge and caused extensive property damage. But what happened was that he had a second one that was actually the device that was a lot larger and in a backpack that was located by the Atlanta PD officers. They detonated that one, as I said before, to render it safe, and no one was injured in that one. So those three bombings all took place before the January 29th one in Birmingham.
And did he do any after the Birmingham bombing?
No, he did not. And again, he was on the run. He had set up, we recovered after he decided to plead guilty to the Birmingham bombing. They went out and he advised them that where he located, he had secreted 250 pounds of material that he was going to use, as well as the bomb that he had already prepared and secreted across from the armory where the guys were staying, where the agents were staying in Andrews. And it also buried with that bomb was the detonator, a remote detonator that he also was going to use along with that bomb that he had already built. He told us where it was, and they were all able to get the 250 pounds plus the bomb that was there after he pled guilty for the Birmingham. Once he pled guilty for Birmingham's bombing, he was transported back to Atlanta and ended up pleading guilty for the 3 bombings in Atlanta.
So where is he today, and what kind of time did he get?
He got life. That's what he pled down to. He didn't want to die, so he pled for life. I forgot what prison they had assigned him to, but he is on life with no parole.
That's pretty fascinating. And I know that all of this was going on about the same time as the Unabomber. So I don't know if he saw himself as, that same type of domestic terrorist as the Unabomber.
No one really knows. I don't even know if he ever sat down to be briefed by our behavioral people. I just don't know. I had already been. I was back at headquarters, so I really didn't get involved in the prosecution side of it. So I don't know if he ever got interviewed to really nail down if you could. Now, I will tell you there were a lot of things that happened during that investigation. Obviously, a lot that I left out, but we located all of his family, his mother, his father. He had, I think, 2 or 3 brothers. One of them was living, I think, in South Carolina. And we sent out leads and what have you. And, of course, we put them on surveillance for a period of time, trying to see if they'd make connection with or he would make connection to them. And the one in South Carolina did an odd thing. I mean, he he came home one day, went into his garage, took a saw and sawed off his hand.
What?
In defiance. Yeah. It was incredible. Agents were out. They were there at his house actually, because we had all the family members under surveillance, trying to see if he would contact them or if they knew anything. And he cut off his hand in defiance of what was going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what good that did.
Yes, it did absolutely nothing. It just showed you how that family was just so disjointed in terms of what they were doing and how they were doing it. They weren't cooperative at all, or at least they attempted or feigned to be cooperating. They didn't know much about their son or their brother, why he would do this or anything else that they provided to us at all. But all in all, it's just a strange group.
Yeah, and this is a fascinating case, but it really talks about dedication to bringing people to justice, that the investigations were going on, and then just the fugitive investigation of being in the mountains and keeping people present for over 5 years of just kind of waiting him out, and that one day he would be caught. And the fact that he was caught in such a anticlimactic way, dumpster diving, and is really one of the more interesting parts of this investigation.
It was, and I tell you, if you speak to any one of the guys that were involved, any of the people who was involved in this, again, the effort that was put into that, just like you said, I mean, we had people up there for years after. We, of course, identified who he was, and the concern, obviously, was would he do it again? It was important to keep as much pressure on him as possible to not allow him to do that. But we all knew that, or we all felt that he was still in that North Carolina mountainous area. The thoughts were, at least from my perspective, was that he was getting help from somebody. I mean, you just don't live out in the woods for 5 years. They would answer all types of issues, and I'm talking about the agents that were assigned there. There are people that have homes there. They only go up there in the wintertime, or they only go up there in the summertime. And if they had break-ins, we were investigating the break-ins. Anything that happened in that area, they were following up on as a potential lead because of the fact that he wasn't in custody, and they knew he was there. So anything that happened in that area was being investigated by FBI and anybody else that was assigned up there.
Tenacious.
And it was something that had to be done. I mean, the guy was indiscriminate in the deaths that he caused, and obviously he was trying to make a bigger scene than that with the responders, but he wasn't able to do that, fortunately. To me, the thing that really cemented things for us was the way things happened right there on the ground in Birmingham with the agencies that were involved. Birmingham PD, State Police had resources there for us, and all of the small departments around there. And it caused, again, the after-action report that they had caused them to consider getting a radio communication system that could be shared by all the police departments in that area. I don't know if they ever implemented that. I left shortly thereafter, so. But that was one of the reasons he got out of the state, or he would have never got back to North Carolina if they were able to put out a wide broadcast for the vehicle and for him.
One of the things that I do on this podcast is I try to dispel, myths and misconceptions about the FBI, and you've helped with that because, one of the things you see in movies and TV shows about the FBI is that we don't play well with others. So you're talking about relationship, a partnership way back then in the late 1990s, where we indeed were able to work with these local and state law enforcement agencies, and not as well with our own interagency workings.
Absolutely. And again, one of the things I always pushed, and And I've had a blessed career. I've had some fortunate things happen to me throughout my career, from the time I came on board, first office in Chicago, and working cases there, and having Chicago police officers help me on an investigation that I did. And the thing that always worked well for me is that if you treat them with respect and fairness, they'll give it back to you. That case I was going to tell you about, it's something just, I had access to 200 Chicago police officers on a fraud case that I handled, a government fraud case that I handled in Chicago, in which they were out doing records retrieval, in other words, issued of subpoenas and what have you on a federal case. The supervisor I was working for was dumbfounded about it, the fact that I was able to get them to commit to doing this work for some case that was going federal, and the only thing they were doing was just helping out. But those are little things that the Bureau doesn't necessarily get credit for. Now, having said that, everything over in Atlanta was in peaches and cream between the agencies over there, and it was something that was abundantly clear to me and the agencies that were working in Birmingham. They weren't treated as well as they should have been. But again, that wasn't something that I was encouraging. Our group got along extremely well. We made sure everybody was in the loop, involved to the entire end. And as a matter of fact, the Birmingham Police Department had guys up in Andrews for a long period of time, and it would shuffle them in and out because they felt that was part of what they had to do, because they lost an officer, and the fact that we're given an opportunity to try to participate in it, they were grateful for that. I don't think we get enough credit for doing that, but sometimes we get in our own way.
So we're winding down now, but before we go, I have to ask you, what's your story? When did you join the FBI? Why did you join the FBI?
Boy, do you really want to go back that far? Well, I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, just outside New York City, and as a kid growing up, I always wanted to be in law enforcement, but I did not necessarily want to be a police officer. Growing up in the 60s, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, as you well know, it was tumultuous times, the race issues, and I just didn't think that was a job for me. So interestingly enough, I said, law enforcement was not uniform law enforcement was not what I wanted to do. I got an application in the end of my sophomore year from the Bureau. And to this day, I don't know where it came from, who it came from, or what. No one's ever stood up and said, yeah, well, I caused it to be sent to you, and nothing. I filled the application out. I graduated 2 years later, and they sent me an invitation to come to the Bureau as a support employee. I had a college degree, and I'm thinking, if I do this, this gives me a foot in the door to what I want to do. And that's what happened.
There are many people who came into the FBI early on in the 60s, 70s, who came through as a clerk first. And so I take it that when you raised your hand and went down to headquarters in this clerical support position, it was because you had been given a qualifying promise that eventually you would be able to become a special agent.
No. I wish I did. I took it on a whim because, again, it was a gamble I thought was something I could take and make it into agent's class. But I didn't know anything about the internal issues of the, support employees and what have you until I got to Atlanta as a accounting technician. In fact, that's how I got into class.
So I'd like to give my guests an opportunity to have the last word. So the last word is yours. What would you like to say?
I've been in the Bureau for 27 years, 25 of them as an agent, and I enjoyed my time immensely. I met a lot of good people. I transferred a lot of places. It gave me an opportunity and a growth that I could never have conceived of. I sat in every chair at headquarters. I was a field supervisor. I went back to headquarters as a field supervisor. I became a unit chief. I became a section chief. I became a deputy. And I say that to say that, every one of those steps, I learned something. Learned something more about the organization and how things ought to be operated. I moved 9 times. The training that you get from the multiple assignments has been missing in the last few years, and as a result, I think we get people promoted who are not quite ready for the job and creates issues as we're going through now that causes one to think, well, what happened to the FBI?
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Joe, links to newspaper articles about the Birmingham abortion clinic bombing, and the capture of Eric Rudolph. There's a picture of Eric Rudolph, and there's also CNN's Fast Facts timeline about the Eric Rudolph investigation. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode's show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. And of course, if you're listening to this on a podcast app, you can share it directly from your device. And do me a favor, subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And each episode will magically appear on your device every week. I don't have a crime fiction recommendation for you. As a matter of fact, I'm working hard on the last bit of revisions and editing for my second crime novel, Greedy Givers. For those of you who were kind enough to pick up a copy of Pay to Play, you know that it was about sex, greed, money, and more, and it had strong language. Greedy Givers follows the same characters, but in this crime novel, I give you Bible scriptures. It's another tale of corruption, greed, and redemption. Here's the premise. The target of her new case claims God gave him the gift to read troubled souls. Special Agent Carrie Wheeler hopes he can't read hers. Special Agent Carrie Wheeler refuses to accept the hero label, even after receiving the FBI and the City of Philadelphia's Medal of Bravery. She just wants to get back to work. Her new case has her investigating Cuthbert Cuddy Mullins, a self-described do-gooder who says he is changing the world for the glory of God. He's accused of running the largest charity Ponzi scheme in the country, as he attempts to convince everyone, wealthy philanthropists, donors, nonprofits, and even himself, that it's all a big misunderstanding. Carrie knows that she and Cuddy have something in common. They are both living a lie. Greedy Givers will be released in June of 2018. In the meantime, you can always pick up a copy of Pay to Play, available as an ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.